In today's video, I will show you why being stuck on a low ISO mindset will likely cost you the photo of a lifetime. And make sure to watch till the end where I will share my high ISO editing workflow and my top tips on how to get great images even when using very high ISOs and never miss the photo of your dreams. Now, when we think about image quality, using low ISOs is one of the key elements to get less noise and great details in your photos. I'm not disputing that at all. In fact, you will also likely get better sharpness and more dynamic range. Yet to me, using low ISOs is a fatal mistake. The best images out there are the ones where something unique and unexpected happens. These are the kind of shots where an animal does some crazy behavior, there's some awesome action in the images, or multiple animals are suddenly entering your frame and all engaging with one another. What all these shots have in common is that they're usually unpredictable and cannot be planned at all. While we sometimes are able to anticipate action and plan for it and be ready, most of the time these moments happen out of nowhere, so we have to be ready for them or miss the best photos. Let's take a second and see what we need to capture these unique moments. The first item is fast enough shutter speeds. Personally, I hate shooting below a 400th of a second, simply because we are moving and the birds are moving. And while it's totally possible with modern cameras and lenses to handhold like a 30th of a second, it's a recipe for disaster, because even if we can be stable and the image stabilization would give us a sharp shot, the bird or the animal is likely moving while we're taking this image, resulting in a blurry shot. I personally prefer much higher shutter speeds if possible. If I can have 1,000th or 2,000th of a second, I'm a happy man, because this will account for much faster movement. The second thing we want to do is to shoot relatively wide open, but not fully wide open. When you look at most lenses, they're actually slightly sharper, stop down one stop. Especially when using cheaper zoom lenses, stopping down one stop will increase image quality and sharpness. And the other reason for not shooting wide open all the time is depth of field, especially when I'm anticipating multiple birds or multiple animals in my frame. Stopping down allows me to have more depth of field and getting more of each bird in focus. If I'm shooting at f2.8 wide open, it's actually hard to get one bird fully in focus, let alone 2 or 3 or 4 birds. So now that we know that we need fast enough shutter speeds and should stop down at least one stop to capture these great moments, the big question is, how can we get there? And when we look at the exposure triangle, we see that the only way to achieve the first two is to bump up our ISO until we achieve a nice and bright exposure and expose our histogram all the way to the right. So if you're stuck on using low ISOs, what will happen is that you're sacrificing one of the two elements. And oftentimes you're already shooting wide open. So what will happen is that you end up using too low shutter speeds to capture any sort of action, resulting in a lot of blurry images. And this is exactly how you miss the photo of a lifetime. And this is not what we want, is it? Now let me share with you some of my most painful photography moments. Believe it or not, I was obsessed with using low ISOs for many years as well, and I wouldn't go above ISO 400. But missing out on literally hundreds of images due to the images being blurry has changed my view forever. I remember one of these painful moments very vividly. It was a beautiful afternoon in Austria. I was lying at the edge of a lagoon and the sun was just setting behind the horizon. And out of nowhere, a large group of European spoonbills landed right in front of me in the shallow water and started fishing. And only a couple minutes after that, a group of grey herons and great egrets landed right amongst the spoonbills and started to actually chase the spoonbills whenever they caught a fish. And there was I with f4, ISO 400 and a 200th of a second, getting mainly blurry images. Now looking back, I want to slap my younger self and tell him, why don't you use ISO 1600, 3200? You can clean up those images later on in post, but don't miss these opportunities because you're stuck on that ISO 400 mindset. I got some photos when the birds were not moving much, but all the crazy action was lost to blurry wings, blurry heads, blurriness everywhere pretty much. So the lesson I want you to remember here is that a noisy image always trumps a blurry image. we can easily fix up the noise later in post-production and still get a great shot, whereas a blurry image usually has to go to the bin. Now, of course, there are limits on how high you can go with your ISO, and this is where DSLR cameras are unfortunately at a clear disadvantage compared to newer mirrorless cameras. Because with these newer mirrorless cameras, even going up as high as ISO 25,600 is no problem in most cases. However, even with DSLR cameras, I would encourage you to at least try out some higher ISO settings, some higher settings than you're usually comfortable with, and run them through a program like DXO Pure RAW, for instance, and I think you will be surprised how nice of an image you can get out of a high ISO file. And if you guys want to learn all about image editing and how to transform your RAW files into amazing looking final images, I would highly recommend to check out my PROSETS and Masterclass down there in the description. With my PROSETS, I enable you with just one click to transform your RAW files into a great starting point for the editing process. And in my Masterclass, I teach you step by step how to transform these RAW files into amazing looking final images. So if this is of interest to you, make sure to check these out down there in the description. Before we move on to some happier moments, I need to share one more painful moment with you guys, because there's actually two things that ruined this photo. First of all, I was using way too low ISOs, ISO 200 in this case, because I was so scared of the noise back in the day. And secondly, I was shooting in AV mode in aperture priority instead of manual mode. So what was actually happening? I set up my camera photographing the birds against the sky. Exposure compensation was set to about -2/3 of a stop. So against the sky, with the low ISO, I was still getting nice shutter speeds and some nice photos. However, when the eagle came down to the water to fish with the claws out, my camera got confused and the metering was now metering the dark background. So my image was overexposed and I ended up with a super slow shutter speed because I had dialed in such a low ISO. And this shot actually taught me two lessons. Don't shoot action like this with varying backgrounds in aperture priority mode. Always shoot these in manual mode. And do not use low ISOs like ISO 200 when shooting action. Dial in much higher ISOs because then you're much more likely to capture any sort of actions against any kind of background. Because with manual mode, you can just set the shutter speed, aperture and ISO and forget about it. And no matter what your background is like, you will always have the correct exposure. Whereas with aperture priority, the camera can get confused like in this case and give you a way too slow shutter speed. So these were some of my most painful, but also most valuable bird photography moments, because while I missed out on the shot, I also learned lessons that helped me to become a better bird photographer for the rest of my life. But why don't we look at some photos now that I only got because I changed my mindset and now shoot slightly stopped down with high enough ISOs and high enough shutter speeds all the time. The first image is this scene of two male gang cockatoos. I was standing in front of these birds for probably 15 or 20 minutes. They were just on that branch preening. So I could have used like ISO 200, gotten a 200th of a second and some nice and clean images. However, I stuck to high ISO and high shutter speeds and I was rewarded. Because out of nowhere, the young bird suddenly started to raise its wings and do a few loops around the branch. So had I used a low ISO, low shutter speed setting, all these shots would have been blurry. But because I did the opposite, I got one of my favorite gang cockatoo photos of all time. Another great example are these mulga parrots. Because there were so many birds flying in and out all the time, I anticipated that I could get a shot of a bird landing with a few other birds actually on my perch already. And so instead of using low ISO to get the best shot of the perch birds, I tried to anticipate the action, and again I was rewarded with the image of this male flying in while a few other birds were sitting on my perch. In all these scenarios, the key here is that you can't anticipate when the action actually happens. These mulga parrots fly in and out and they don't come back for 15 minutes and there may be one bird on the perch and suddenly there's 5 more birds coming in. So I have to be ready at all times. And to me, ready means having a high enough shutter speed and high enough ISO setting that I can always capture the action when it happens. Another recent photo shoot where using high ISO saved the day and gave me some of my favorite photos of all time was in a deep dark rainforest in far north Queensland where I was photographing displaying birds of paradise. And in this scenario, it's actually hard to get any sort of shutter speed. So I was shooting already basically wide open, and I had to use very high ISO above 16,000 up to 25,600 to even get like a 3/20th, 400th of a second. Because as you remember, A 400th of a second is kind of my lowest limit that I want when photographing any kind of action, because below that I just feel like I get too many blurry images. So while even I felt a little bit uncomfortable photographing at these settings, it was the only way to get photos there. And if we look at these final images, you would actually not guess that they were shot at such high ISOs, would you? If I had stuck to like ISO 400 or 800 in like a 30th of a second, I would have likely gotten almost only blurry images and had a very frustrating day instead of one of my best days in my photography life. I actually made a video about the whole shoot, so go and check that out if you're interested in that. Another reason to have relatively high ISO and shutter speeds dialed in even for perched birds is that often birds suddenly take off. So in these cases, if you're anticipating the takeoff and have the right settings dialed in, you can get some fantastic takeoff shots. Now some of you might say, why don't you do both, Jan? Take some images at high ISO and higher shutter speeds, and if the bird's not doing much, change your settings to a lower ISO and lower shutter speed and get some slightly better image quality. My response to that is, it's a good strategy, but why risk it? How do I know that not exactly in the moment I'm changing my settings, the bird will do something crazy and I miss the moment? Now let's talk about my editing workflow, because when you're using high ISOs or super high ISOs, you need to have a great workflow and need a few helpers to get rid of the extra noise and make your images look beautiful and nice and vibrant in the end. Usually I start the process by running my RAW files to DXO Pure RAW to remove all the excess noise. And DXO Pure RAW is actually running a promotion at the moment where you get a $30 coupon until February 12th if you download the free trial that I've linked for you down there in the description. So if you haven't used it yet, this might be a great opportunity for you. DXO Pure RAW 2 doesn't actually have that many settings. You just drag your RAW file into the program, turn off the lens sharpening and the global lens adjustment. At least that's what I do, because I don't really like what they do to my image. Press start, and within a few seconds you have a noise-free DNG image that you can now drag into Lightroom or Camera Raw for further editing. I like to use Camera Raw, so I open up the file in Camera Raw, and then the first thing I do is select the right profile. You can use the Adobe ones, which are free, but I personally like to use my PROSETS because they give me, with just one click, an amazing starting point. They don't only give me the best colors, but they also give me a great preset that changes a few things here and there, so my image looks already amazing with just one click and doesn't need too much further editing in Photoshop. So once I pick the presets that I like the best, vibrant, more contrast for me for most of my images, I open it up in Photoshop. Once I have the photo in Photoshop, I run my workflow on it that I teach you step by step in my masterclass. But what I usually do is select the background, so I can treat the background and the bird separately. So oftentimes I lighten the background and I darken the bird a little bit to separate the two more and make the bird more stand out. I like to use levels, curves, hue saturation, and selective color to make more tweaks on the bird and the background, and to make my images look overall really nice and vibrant. And I run all these on their own separate layers, so I can make changes at any point in time. And if the image still has some noise remaining, there's another nice little helper, Topaz DeNoise, that can get rid of any more noise that might still be lingering in the file. Once I've done all my tweaks, run the image through my workflow, I just save it, and I save it for web, and I end up with some beautiful final images that don't look like they were taken with high ISOs. And now listen carefully, because here's my top tip for using high ISOs. Position yourself in a way so that you have a brighter background behind your subject, because bright backgrounds just don't show the noise. Look at these two examples of the yellow robin and the flame robin. They're taken with the same settings of the same bird, and simply by moving from a dark background to a light background, I essentially eliminated all the noise in the images. This is one of the many reasons that you see light backgrounds in my images. Personally, I also like the look of bright backgrounds better, but it also helps me to use very high ISOs without the noise actually showing up in the image. So whenever you have the choice between a bright background and a dark background, I would always opt for the bright background, because it will simply not show the noise even if you're shooting at crazy high ISO settings. And another tip I have for you at the end is, do not underexpose your images a lot when already shooting in dark environments, because by underexposing you get more shutter speed, but you also end up with much darker images that you then have to lift up in the editing process. And by lifting up these images 1, 2, 3 stops when you're editing them, you're actually introducing a lot of noise to the images. And in my experience, it's better to use higher ISOs and expose the images correctly than using less ISOs and underexposing a lot, because in the end, the darker image will actually have more noise than the image taken at higher ISOs with the correct exposure. So use bright backgrounds and don't underexpose your images, and you're halfway there to fantastic images with high ISOs. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and that I could at least give you some food for thought that only using low ISOs might not be the way going forward. If I achieved that, I'm already a happy man. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up for it. Let me know all your thoughts about using high ISOs and low ISOs in the comments. And I will see you guys in the next video very soon. Bye.